Find a new way to live in Toronto's coveted Forest Hill neighbourhood. Foray by Canderel blends thoughtful, livable suite design with refined finishes and more than 50,000 square feet of amenities, including wellness spaces, work-from-home areas, fitness facilities, and places to unwind. A modern, elevated community crafted for the life you've earned. Your next home starts from $599,000. Learn more at live@foray.ca. That's live at FORET.ca.
Either we need money or action, or ideally both. And I think, Toronto's a great example of that. We see hate marches going through Jewish neighborhoods with a police escort protecting the hate marchers. And the only people that got arrested are anyone who confronts them.
The Jewish community has lived under intolerable conditions of insecurity over the past years without requisite action on that score.
It's not an either or. What we want is both. We want better legislation and we want better enforcement.
This week marks 1 year since the election of Mark Carney as Canada's Prime Minister. On April 28, 2025, he won a minority government. And over the past year, he's consolidated that mandate, recently turning the minority into a working majority while promising to fight against Donald Trump's trade tariffs and to confront rising anti-Semitism at home. The anniversary now lands in a week that puts those promises under a microscope. B'nai Brith's annual anti-Semitism audit drops Monday. Last year, it recorded 6,219 incidents, the highest ever recorded in Canada. But physical and online attacks against Jewish institutions and people have continued unabated since October 7th, 2023, and weekly protests take place targeting a Jewish Toronto neighborhood. The latest flashpoint this past weekend, and an attempted forced entry by a suspect into a Sephardic synagogue in Thornhill, who, when he was turned away, assaulted a family entering the shul before he fled. Canadian Jewish leaders have called for a massive infusion of safety money to the tune of $100 million, which they hope will be in Tuesday's spring economic statement, Carney's first since he was elected. All this in last week's report by the Senate's Human Rights Committee, calling anti-Semitism a clear and present danger, should put Jewish issues on the government agenda at a critical week for the community. So 1 year into the renewed mandate with new data and new decisions looming, how will Carney respond? And what has his government actually delivered for Jewish Canadians so far? Our CJN political panel insiders are back with their hot takes. I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Carney's Combating Hate Act, Bill C-9, passed through the House of Commons last month and is now before the Senate for examination. Ottawa dissolved the business status of the Samadoun organization, which is a pro-terrorist fundraising group, and after the 3 Toronto synagogue shootings that same week in March, the public safety minister gave $10 million in emergency funding for security at Jewish community safety hubs. The Prime Minister has also shown symbolic support. He personally attended Holocaust memorial ceremonies and Hanukkah and Rosh Hashanah events, and he stood in solidarity after the Bondi Beach massacre. But critics say that's not enough, because his foreign policy positions against Israel have made things worse for Jews here at home on the ground, as has his avoiding challenging Quebec's government on new secularism laws which ban public sector workers from wearing religious symbols. So how does his first year measure up? Joining us now are David Birnbaum in Montreal. He's a former Liberal MNA in the Quebec legislature. Noah Tepperman in Windsor is a former NDP riding president, now reevaluating his membership in the party after the election of Avi Lewis as NDP leader. And Dan Mader joins from Ottawa. He's a conservative strategist with Loyalist Public Affairs. It's good to see you all. Welcome back to the CJN's North Star. In the last few weeks, we've had a stunning developments in the House of Commons with the Liberals now a majority. Folks, how did that happen, and what does this mean?
Not that much in my humble view, because I think pragmatically speaking, we were in a similar place with respect to legislative room and maneuverability 4 weeks ago. In a way, it's now been formalized. For 2 reasons. One, a dubious one, because a bunch of folks have crossed the floor, and that always and properly raises ethical questions. And the other is, of course, the by-election wins, including quite significantly the one in Quebec, which is not good news for the Pats Québécois and which is perhaps good news for our Jewish community.
Yeah, look, I think I'd agree with a lot of that. I think it is a bit more secure. This may mean they can get legislation through the House more quickly. One of the things that surprised me about this government is they have not been very effective at getting legislation through. I think that has in some ways been a bit of an afterthought for the Prime Minister and his team, or more concentrating on what they can do quickly without passing legislation. And now they should, in theory, be able to move stuff more quickly. But we'll see if they sort of take advantage of that ability and what they do with it.
You know, I was encouraged certainly to see the government being able to work with the Conservatives on passing Bill C5.
What is C5?
The infrastructure spending bill.
Okay, the big bill. Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to push back on something that Dan said. I'm surprised nobody else did when you said, by the way, you know, it took a long time they didn't seem to be that concerned about passing legislation quickly. Bill C9, the Conservatives were the ones who were filibustering, according to what the Liberals were saying, to keep this bill on combating hate from actually passing in committee, and strongly opposed it.
Yeah, look, I was thinking more of a few kind of other kind of measures that were less controversial, like taking the HST off new homes for first-time home buyers that took almost a year for the government to pass and bring into force. I think, you know, the anti-hate legislation is incredibly controversial. The Conservatives take a view that this is not going to actually combat hate. It is only going to result in, for instance, members of our community being published for speaking up against terror and against hate. And I happen to agree with that. So, you know, I think that there are uncontroversial measures that have taken a long time to get through the House. I think that it is right in a minority parliament. The opposition does its job fighting against measures that it has fundamental disagreements with.
As far as the Canadian Jewish community, though, diverse as it is, under the Carney government now, the majority government, where do we stand?
In terms of Israel?
There's Israel. We can talk about that first. And later, we got to talk about safety, security, and anti-Semitism. Under a majority government now, where does the Jewish communities stand when it talks about Israel?
It seems like a pretty straightforward question, but I think there's a lot of material there. You know, you've got things that are the status quo that haven't changed in a material way. I think the first thing that you can look at is trade and economic ties. There continues to be a very strong, very robust relationship there. Looking at it from the outside, that's not something which I think has changed radically. And you've got the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement as an example of that. There's still a lot in terms of science, technology, and innovation in terms of sharing and relationships and collaboration between the two countries. When it comes to security and multilateral cooperation, there is still a lot that is present there. That is not to say that there isn't pressure. And you know, going back to the first question about Carney and managing his caucus, you know, he does have to manage a caucus that includes people who are very supportive of Israel and people who are very unsupportive of Israel. And that's a balancing act that he's continuing to walk. He's also got to manage a relationship with a country that has a leader whose values don't necessarily line up with his own country's values. That makes for a very, very complex relationship. And when you also look at the fact that, at least based on the Iran war, that is a war that involves three countries, one of which is Israel, the other one of which is the United States, that makes for even greater complexity, because what Israel wants and what Israel's strategies are may or may not be what the United States wants or what its strategies are, and the U.S. is the much bigger gorilla in that particular partnership.
The Prime Minister, who I think we would agree has clearly created additional international space for Canada to be at certain tables. His name would be a known entity in so many places around the world where typically a Canadian Prime Minister's name would not be known. That strikes me as leverage that is probably comforting to all Canadians, including Jewish Canadians. The fact that we have a little bit more room to do and say what we need to say. And that room also has socioeconomic benefits that we can look to accrue. It requires the Prime Minister to be as responsible as possible on an international stage. And that responsibility, one would hope, includes thoughtful statements about world stability and about the absolute importance of, in reasonable and smart yet dangerous ways, reducing the influence of this terrible rogue regime in Iran, that's obviously of interest to the Jewish community and to Israel. We'd all agree that by definition, we are going to be somewhat unsatisfied with a federal government's positioning on Israel, and clearly more dissatisfied when it's confronted with reacting to a very controversial government in Israel right now. So there's a level of dissatisfaction that I think is our default in the Jewish community. Will that level go up or down? I'm somewhat hopeful that it'll go down a bit with this federal government now having some additional leverage as a majority.
And how will it go down?
Well, I guess in the obscure way I'm suggesting, I would expect there to be some additional impetus to do the right thing by, first of all, a community that's so deeply anchored in Canada and deserves its issues to be dealt with, and to track a responsible position, one would hope, on Israel and the Middle East as well.
Okay, Dan, come on in.
You can get a pretty good understanding of the prime minister and what he is likely to do by thinking that he is really focused on economics, on the economy, more than on foreign affairs. On foreign affairs, mostly it's thinking about how do you respond to President Trump? How do you handle President Trump? And a comfort level with Europe, and working to build stronger alliances with Europe as part of how to counter that. And I think a lot of what he does flows from that. I think the most positive thing we can say about some of his dealings with Israel is that I don't think it's a huge issue for him, but I think he's going along with kind of his the leaders in Europe that he's comfortable with. I think, there are some things that have been worrisome lately. I think, his decision last week to promote the Iranian regime at the UN into a leadership position when the past candidate opposed that seemed to be just trying to quietly oppose President Trump and his war on Iran by, supporting the mullahs and the regime at the UN. I think that's really dangerous. I think Canada should be saying, you know what? We need to free the Iranian people from the occupation. It's concerning. I don't think we're in a great place. I think vis-a-vis the last prime minister, I don't know. I mean, we're definitely Canada's a stronger place in the world than the last prime minister. It was hard for us to go the opposite way, but we have a stronger place in the world. Whether, our community should feel better, I don't know. I mean, look, the signs aren't good. The signs aren't good.
This current round of conflict was initiated by Israel and the United States. And you can't lose sight of that. I'm not saying that it's everything, but I'm also saying that it's not nothing. And those sirens are going off in Israel because Israel initiated a war. And the tactics and outcomes of that war aren't clearly being enunciated by anybody.
It's also provoked domestic in Canada attacks on Jews in Jewish synagogue schools online since February 28th and even before. I've covered it. I've been to the synagogues that were shot at in Toronto on the early morning. Carney's government is now a majority. What do we expect them to do to help keep Canadian Jews, 400,001 of us, safe? So they couldn't do before.
We want to see what the impact of Bill C-9 is. I think that's going to be very important. Whether or not the Conservatives were right on that particular point remains to be seen. I happen to think that, it's not an either or. What we want is both. We want better legislation and we want better enforcement. This clarifies and improves some of the legislation for enforcement. So let's now continue to hold the government accountable to following through on that.
Yeah, I think we often forget that there's all kinds of laws on the books that sit on the books and don't do anything. And we'll see if we can expect the C-9 to get through the Senate. But then I think there are visible and essential steps that we have a right to expect with respect to formal discussions with law enforcement authorities across the provinces and within the federal government, with municipalities who are given some new levers here, to see that this law not be a dead letter. The Jewish community has lived under intolerable conditions of insecurity over the past years without requisite action on that score. Furthermore, like I say, attorneys general in the provinces, the law enforcement authorities, municipal authorities can do nothing if they're not compelled to do something, including not even understanding the law that will have been adopted. So I think we have a right to expect when this gets to the Senate to see that it's not simply pro forma, that there are follow-up actions that are taken with respect to communications and on-the-ground implementation that would show the community and show Canadians that it matters when communities are targeted for their identity and their religion in hateful and threatening ways. Something gets done. And the federal government can show some leadership beyond getting this law adopted to demonstrate that point.
What about money? We have an economic statement coming out April 28th. What would be a meaningful amount of money that the community would get if that is in the next statement for security?
The announcement of that $10 million that goes back a while now, and having worked in community security when I was executive director of the Canadian Jewish Congress in Quebec, the money dissipates very, very quickly. $10 million is pretty modest. So there would have to be an expectation of a consequent follow-up. I'm not sure I'd want to place a bet on whether we'll see that. We have a right to expect it, though.
Dan?
Either we need money or action, or ideally both. And I think, Toronto's a great example of that. We see hate marches going through Jewish neighborhoods with a police escort protecting the hate marchers. And the only people that got arrested are anyone who confronts them. And so I think that's the conservative, the right-wing fear about new legislation is it will only be used against us if it's used at all. We're not seeing laws enforced. I think there's a feeling if we ever did see them enforced, judges would throw them out anyway. But we're not seeing enforcement because there's no political will to tackle this. The only time we get any kind of accountability in Canada is if we're worried that President Trump might be offended. Then suddenly there's accountability. Otherwise, there is no accountability for politicians who mess up or don't act. And just doesn't seem like people are motivated to take action. And there's a lot of debate, I think, about how to do that and how to get broader Canadians to care. And I think there is a way to get people to care about the threat to law and order, the threat to Canada more broadly of jihadism. But until then, and until the politicians like Premier Ford, as much as the Prime Minister, are actually feeling some political pressure from their voters, not just our community, but broader voters saying, clean up the streets, there isn't going to be a lot of pressure to act.
I think this is a place, where the conservative talking points tend to lose a lot of nuance, certainly conveniently so. And I'd be the first to say that there hasn't been enough enforcement. But that's not to say that there hasn't been enforcement. You look at the conviction last week of somebody who lives in my neck of the woods, somebody who's from LaSalle, essentially a suburb of Windsor, who was convicted for a series of online offenses with a pretty significant conviction there too. That's not nothing.
Matthew Althorpe got 20 years, and they've just arrested the guy who allegedly shot at the restaurant, in the Jewish restaurant, 2 days after the video, and the guy with the very disgusting hook-nosed insect man from the Bathurst and Shepherd. So there's not nothing. There is
absolutely, and unfortunately, the repeated theme that nothing is happening tends to be a whole lot louder than the recognition of the things that have happened, which actually skews our community's perspective on the state of affairs in a way that I think is not healthy. The other thing that I think we have to talk about, and this I think is something, while it's an Ontario piece from the legislature, it does have a national impact. Michelle Cooper's private members motion from last week and the unanimous support that it got, I think is really, really significant for the Specialized Hate Crime Unit. That is a response. It is a response that got unanimous support from within the legislature here in Ontario. That's absolutely not nothing. And while that's not a federal piece of legislation, that is something that takes place in Toronto, which is the largest Jewish community in the country. And we have to keep that in perspective as well.
Right. Coming up, sparks will fly over whether the NDP looks more like right-wing fascist parties in Europe than a left-wing Canadian movement. And will Carney throw Quebec's Jewish community under the bus? Stay tuned. Folks, we're talking about the domestic political landscape. There has been a new player on the scene. And folks, we talked about Avi Lewis, elected as leader of the NDP, not sitting in the House. Historically, it's significant for the Jewish community to have Avi Lewis as leader, just in terms of historical timelines of how many Jews have run big things in politics. Whether you agree with him or not, that's different. But I want to ask you, what does this do to the position of anti-Zionism and normalization of anti-Israel political policies now that he actually gets to go and talk in the lobby and is a party now with official party status?
So when you look at the way they have sort of assigned the critic roles within the current caucus, that's not part of his official responsibilities, as a shadow critic. Those responsibilities still fall to people like Heather McPherson.
So can I push you on that to make it
Absolutely.
clearer? In other
Yeah.
words, do you think he's not going to be having a role in making anti-Zionism more maybe palatable, normalized? We can talk about that.
By being elected to the leadership, he continues to make it more palatable. I don't think he's going to be the person who makes it palatable. Before he was elected leader, it certainly seemed to be quite palatable, across much of the country. And I think, going along with sort of the populist political trends, we're likely to see that kind of thing continue. He will be a player in that. If he is the person out there using his voice and his language and his moments in front of a microphone and a camera to speak about anti-Zionism, that will make it aggressively worse. If Heather McPherson is the person doing that as his sort of mouthpiece on those points, it will also advance those points forward, not quite as much as it would if Avi Lewis were the one making those points. I think one of the most damaging things that I've seen so far from him since he was elected leader was what I would describe as sort of a revisionist history take on his family's relationship with anti-Zionism. Stephen Lewis was a Zionist. David Lewis was a Zionist, and for Avi Lewis to speak to his family's tradition of anti-Zionism, to me, is a concerning flag, because there's a revisionist history element to it, and I'm not a fan of that kind of revisionist history.
I think we should remember that Avi Lewis has just been elected leader of a party that almost elected the Prime Minister of Canada less than a decade ago with Tom Mulcair. Avi Lewis has so many massive challenges before him. I don't like what he said and what he's done with respect to Israel and the Middle East, but I think he wants to say nothing about this issue where we might deplore his stand before he says something about tons of other issues that are aimed at having the NDP reappear on the political spectrum as a somewhat credible political force. He's got a ton of work ahead of him to do that. And Avi Lewis has so many jobs before, even if he was inclined, he gets to spend his political capital on saying destructive things about Israel and the Middle East, that I'm not overly worried about him having this new platform.
Dan, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, look, I think that we shouldn't be normalizing the NDP. I think they should be totally ostracized the way in like Alternatives for Germany or any kind of a far-right extremist party would be. Because you don't get a bigot as leader unless you're a bigoted party. And let's be clear, Avi Lewis is an anti-Israeli bigot. He's a hater, and he's promoting hatred against Israelis because he's a party full of people who believe in that kind of hatred. And I think that what we all need to be doing is making clear that this party is outside of the mainstream and is unacceptable, and people shouldn't be treating them as a normal political party anymore.
To which I would also say, "O ye without sin, cast the first stone." And there's a certain irony, to hearing a conservative take that kind of position, knowing that in the same way that the NDP has done, in this instance, conservatives have been willing to take support from wherever it's been offered, whether those people line up with the values of every single elected member of the party or not. And that's the kind of reason why somebody like me is doing everything possible to investigate the opportunities to sever my provincial and federal relationships for these two parties.
So you're announcing this here today.
I'm certainly looking into it. And it's not a shocker. I'm not the only one. There are plenty of people who are doing it.
Point of order, the Conservative leader, when Trudeau was Prime Minister, had to deal with 3 members of his party who posed for pictures with an art, Christine, I forget her last name, who came to Canada, and he's, got slapped on the wrist. David, speaking of political developments, the CAQ in Quebec now has said goodbye to Premier Legault, and they have a new leader. What do you know about her relations or anything with the Jewish community? And secondly, I want to also talk to you about the whole Jewish community impact of the new law about even tighter laïcité rules, which some people support. So those two things. Give us an update.
I think it's a pretty blank page with respect to the new Premier Minister désigné and the Jewish community. The only thing that gives me a modicum of comfort is that she has a very strong background with respect to human rights and equality in her earlier lives. And look, she's part of a party whose record with respect to language legislation and inclusion is pretty spotty, to say the least. So there's some, I think there's some concern there and a relationship to be built when, as always, sadly, we're not at the top of the agenda. And with the Quebec election on the horizon, we're clearly not on the top of the agenda. I would want to mention with respect to Bill 9, which, goes further than Bill 21, which is before Canada's Supreme Court. That is a clear and present danger. And when the Prime Minister of Canada itches on the notwithstanding clause, we scratch vigorously in our English-speaking / Jewish community. Let's remember the bulk of Quebec's Jewish community remains of Ashkenazic origin and speaks English. Listen, there'll be discussions, and our Jewish community has been really good about building discreet and somewhat solid relationships with Quebec bureaucracies when it comes to everything from the very funding of Jewish day schools to the notion, which could be quite clearly illegal, of Jewish schools next year commemorating Yom HaShoah and including a prayer that would likely be part of such a service within a school, a Jewish day school funded by the government. So there's some really worrisome stuff in here. Like always with bad legislation, you enable the folks on the fringes, those who are intolerant, to jump on board opportunistically and call into question all kinds of legitimate arrangements, like I say, up to and including what remains a model for the rest of the country, that is the funding of secular studies within our Jewish day school system to the tune of 60 cents on every dollar. I mean, it's a pretty important relationship, which Bill 9 now once again, this often happens, but puts at some real risk. So that bill is a real concern for the Jewish community, and I come back to it being a real concern to hear the Prime Minister of Canada in his first meeting with Quebec's Premier Ministre désigné to say, don't worry, be happy. We're not about to do anything to limit the implementation of the notwithstanding clause. That's scary and ominous news for Jewish Quebecers.
What's going on in the Supreme Court is extremely dangerous in terms of whether Canada is going to remain a democracy at all or be ruled by an unelected bunch of judges. I mean, we already have our rights being limited constantly by the courts. You know, everything from the right to be safe, the right to actually deport people who are a threat to our country, the right to equal justice before the law, not have race-based justice, and sentencing discounts based on race, the right to trade interprovincially, the right to not be forced to join a union. We're constantly having our rights limited by an unelected legislature that calls itself the Supreme Court. And if we don't have the escape valve of the notwithstanding clause, then we start to wonder, what do we even bother electing governments to do anymore? Because they don't make the decisions. And so this is a fundamentally important hearing and decision that's going on, where the Supreme Court has real temptation to give itself even more power at the expense of our democratically elected leaders.
I think that's a vast, vast overstatement. Canadians, including a vast majority of Canadian Jews, support the fact that our regime, our democratic constitutional monarchy, includes an entrenched Charter of Rights and Freedoms, guided and ruled over first and foremost by the legislatures across the country, and with proper checks and balances by a Supreme Court. And when it doesn't behave, governments can then move forward within reason and demonstrate the need for a law to be adopted, notwithstanding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. To note that be an emergency valve rather than a routine, blind power to secure some esoteric principle of parliamentary supremacy, which already exists. Those are two very different things.
It's good to hear you guys sort of diplomatically having it at it. Everyone is so collegial. This is the first time I've actually heard David push back on anything. I love it. Look, we have to wrap it up. One success for the Carney government that has happened and maybe one not so success.
You can talk about the fact that the Prime Minister has moved Canada's reputation on the globe into a place that far more closely resembles the tradition of which most of us as Canadians are proud of. The fact that Canada's outreach to Europe and the European Union has been as effective as it has also been really important. So that's one option. The other option is to look at the fact that he's created a majority government. That's a pretty big success.
Thank you. All right. Dan, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Look, I would say one big success, people want to hear from Canada internationally again. And whether you agree or disagree with what the Prime Minister said in some of his big international speeches, and I disagree philosophically with a lot of it, people are interested in it, they want to hear it, and they know that it's going to be substantive and based on principles and not just sort of the sort of buzzword soup that we tended to get over the last few years. So I think that is important, and that is good for the country. I would say the biggest failure is not getting stuff built yet, and we already see the ambition going down, whether it's housing, whether it's, energy projects.
Yeah. And David?
I think I would frame it by saying to create, in this very difficult period, given what happens to the south of us, the expectation that Canada will begin to fundamentally reorient itself towards much greater productivity and diversity on the world stage, which, if properly followed through, results in greater stability, economic wealth, and then the ability to treat everybody properly because greater wealth will have been created. So I would put that in the success with a star beside it. Has got to be seen to happen.
Yeah, I think the affordability in housing, and housing certainly touched on Dan's point, that's been a nothing burger based on both the Prime Minister's promises for focus and also the need, in Canada. Our food inflation remains, incredibly high, not just at home, but also comparatively. In a time when we are facing all of the international inflationary and economic pressures, that means that Canadians are still really struggling. And frankly, that is a point that Avi Lewis, so far in his new role, has been communicating very effectively, and something that Mr. Poilievre has also been effectively communicating towards. If he wants to really to change the way Canadians are feeling about him here at home, the Prime Minister has to get serious about that and get serious about those investments at a time when spending is going to be facing a lot of pressure.
Because in economic times that are perilous, instability, Jews always suffer. In history, not just now. They're always blamed. And so you can only hope that if you're saying build stuff and spend stuff and make Canada a better and more affordable place, that would be a good thing for the Jews. And I'm not a pundit, so I mean, is that okay if I say that?
Absolutely.
We will see you again in the fall and see how the majority is done since then. Talk to you guys soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Bye.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. So has Carney been good for Canada's Jews? After Tuesday's mini-budget, why not write to us and tell us whether the government delivered? We're at info@thecjn.ca. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman with Michael Freeman as our executive producer and Alicia Richler as the editorial director. Thanks for listening.